Okay, so this is the final video in our videos where we consider the different structure and anatomy of trees. So in this video, we're going to talk about reproduction. We talked about leaves and shoots and roots in previous videos. And so we're going to start with conifer reproduction because conifers and hardwoods do things a little differently. Conifers are gymnosperms or naked-seeded flowering or naked-seeded plants, and angiosperms are flowering plants. Right? Hardwoods are angiosperms. So with conifer reproduction, if you look at any conifer tree, we usually see two types of cones. And cones are sort of the seed-producing structures on the plant. Remember, conifers don't have flowers like hardwoods. So what you see over here in the left diagram is a tree, and we see these kinds of cones. These are the seed cones, or sometimes called the female cones, and they typically grow on the upper branches of a tree. And then on lower branches, we see a different kind of cone, and these are the male cones, or the pollen cones. The pollen cones, of course, produce pollen, and that pollen can kind of drift on the wind, in the air currents, and carry to hopefully another tree, land on the seed cones, and fertilize the seed cones, fertilize the ovule. Down here in the bottom, we can see what happens at fertilization. So the pollen is the vessel in which sperm are carried, and the sperm can migrate down here to the ovule, and that will cause the fertilization and the development of a seed. Seeds develop in the cones, and then the seeds are dispersed, and we can germinate a new generation of trees. Here's just some examples over here on the right. So I've got Rocky Mountain juniper in the left column, and the seed cones here are these little round structures. A lot of people call these berries or juniper berries. They're not berries. Berries, in the botanical sense, berries are fleshy fruit created by a flowering plant. But these are actually cones. They're fleshy cones with seeds inside, but they're not produced from a flower. And then on the lower branches of Rocky Mountain juniper, down here we can see the pollen cones. And so in these little structures is where the pollen is created. Over here, maybe a little more familiar, is ponderosa pine. So like all pines, they have these sort of really large woody cones. These are the female cones, the seed cones. And then down here on the lower branches, you can see the pollen cones here. When these things are ripe in the spring or early summer, the pollen cones, you can touch those and you can see a big dust, a big cloud of pollen will come off them, and the pollen will kind of drift away in the air. The reason that the pollen cones are at the bottom of the tree is it's generally better to outcross, right? You want your pollen to fertilize the cones of another tree rather than yourself. And if the pollen cones were on the upper part of the tree, you would see a lot of selfing, which is not good if you're concerned about genetic variation. So with the pollen cones down lower and the seed cones up higher, you're more likely to get pollen from a different individual fertilizing those seed cones. Okay, now angiosperms, our hardwoods, our trees of flowering plants, work a little differently. So here's just a typical angiosperm flower. And we see some different structures here. So we often see petals or some kind of showy petals. We have sepals down at the bottom here. And then the reproductive structures, we've got the male and female reproductive structures in the flower here. So over here, the stamens are the male reproductive parts. It's basically, this is where the pollen is produced, and so we have a filament, which is this sort of linear thing here, and then an anther. And the anther is where the pollen grains are produced and stored and released. The female parts of the flower are the pistil. So this structure in the middle here, and we can see we have the stigma at the top. This is where pollen grains can land, and then a pollen tube will germinate and go down the style, the middle part of the female part. And then down here we have the ovary, and our ovules here are awaiting fertilization that will become the seeds. In flowering plants, the ovule will, or the ovary, will often swell into some kind of fruit. So this is where we could produce true berries or palms, things like apples and things like that, or even nuts. So different structures in a flowering plant. Now, flowering plants don't always have all of both the male and female parts of the flower on the same flower, on the same structure. If we do, we call that a perfect flower. So if we have both, if we have the ovaries and or the ovary and the style and the stigma and everything, and the stamens, all in the same flower, we call that a perfect flower. However, sometimes we just have only female flowers or pistillate flowers, and so we just have the pistil here. And sometimes we only have the male parts, the stamen or a staminate flower, like we do over here. So those are called imperfect flowers, and those can be male or female. And now sometimes the male and female flowers can be on the same tree or the same plant. And sometimes they're separated into different individuals. So we would have like female plants and male plants. That's one way of simplifying it. So if we have separate individuals, if we have separate male and female flowers on different individuals, we call that dioecious. So dioecious means we have two different individuals, males and females. If the male and female flowers are on the same individual, we call that monoecious. So the pistillate and staminate flowers on the same individual. Down here are some illustrations, some photos of aspen, quaking aspen, Populus tremuloides. And here we see the female catkins or amenths. These are clusters of flowers, and these flowers are all pistillate flowers. Over here we see the male catkins or amenths, and those are all staminate flowers. So these over here produce the pollen, and these produce the seeds. Here's a close-up of an individual flower on the bottom, and individual anther sacs down here. Now here's a little quiz. Like our conifers, some hardwoods, some flowering plants are wind pollinated. So they rely on the wind to disperse the pollen to female parts of flowers and produce fruits and seeds. But some are animal pollinated. So some angiosperms have evolved to entice animals to come and move their pollen for them. So if we look at these, I've got three species here: northern red oak, sugar maple, and American linden. Two of these are wind pollinated and one is animal pollinated. You can pause the video here and think about which one do you think is animal pollinated, and then come back and see if you're right. Okay, have you done it? All right, if you guessed that American linden is the animal pollinated one, then you are correct. You can see some key differences here. So a lot of trees, all of our wind pollinated trees like oak and maple, they usually don't have very showy flowers. You see the very small greenish flowers on both of these species here. And they usually flower before the leaves are out, or at least before the leaves are very big. So you can see these oak leaves, they're very young in the spring. Those are probably only a few days old. And I don't even know if we can see any maple leaves on this twig here. And that's because if you're wind pollinated, you don't really want those leaves blocking the wind. You want the wind to be able to carry that pollen away, hopefully to another tree where it can land on a receptive flower and produce seeds. Now linden flower in the summer, in the middle of summer, and they do that because it's warmer and bees are more active. But to do that, the leaves are already out. So these flowers you can see are kind of hidden underneath and in between the leaves of the tree. But that doesn't matter because the bees will find those flowers anyway, because those flowers smell fantastic. If you've ever been around a linden tree while it's flowering, I mean, the smell is incredibly sweet and wonderful. And so they entice the bees with the smell and then with nectar that the flowers produce. So the bees come in there to gather nectar and pollen, and then as a byproduct, some of that pollen sticks to them, and as they move to another flower, some of that pollen could come off onto the stigma of the other flower, and fertilization can happen. And we can see a number of different kinds of adaptations of animal pollinated versus wind pollinated flowers. So kind of like the earlier diagram I showed you, an insect pollinated or an animal pollinated flower might have to have different things to entice those pollinators to come and visit. So usually there's visual cues like some kind of showy petals. There's often scent cues of wonderful smelling nectar or something like that. And then of course there has to be a reward for that pollinator. The bees wouldn't visit that flower just to do the tree a favor and pollinate it. The bees are there to collect nectar and to collect pollen that they eat too. So there has to be some enticement. So we get flowers. You can see these nice white flowers with big petals, and the smell is wonderful. A wind pollinator flower, there's no point in being showy with big petals and things like that, because it's just relying on the wind. So usually these things, you have these long stalks, these long filaments on those anthers to let the pollen kind of blow out in the wind. The stigma are usually sort of feathery looking to collect any pollen that's blowing around in the air. The pollen grains themselves are different too. Down here at the bottom I've got electron microscope images of some pollen. This is over here on the left, this is pollen from the Asteraceae family, the sunflower family, which are animal pollinated. And you can see these little spiky appendages on the pollen grain. And that's to help the pollen clump together and also stick to insects. So they'll be carried along from one flower to the other. Over here, this is an electron micrograph of a pine pollen grain. And the pine, these two sort of Mickey Mouse ear looking things, those are air sacs. They're pretty hollow. And then most of the pollen grain stuff is down here at the bottom. And those air sacs give the pollen grain a lot of buoyancy. So they're very, very lightweight. They're very low density, and they can fly, they can float on air currents really well to be carried to another flower. You can see similar structures, not air sacs, but you can see similar structures of the pollen grain that makes them more buoyant on things like oak pollen and maple pollen and our wind pollinated trees. A couple of other interesting seed related stuff as we consider reproduction of trees. So one adaptation that some trees have is called cone serotiny. They have what we call serotinous cones. Notably lodgepole pine, which you see here in this diagram, and Table Mountain pine in the southeastern US have cone serotiny, which means those cones only open if they get really hot, usually from the heat of a fire. So there's special waxes that hold the cone scales together, and the seeds stay in there, and they can stay viable on the tree for quite a while. Then if you have a wildfire, like we see on the right, those cones will open because the wax melts off and the seeds drop out into a nice mineral soil seed bed with no competition. Lodgepole pine grows at pretty high densities and the crowns interlock, so they typically burn at really high severity where most, if not all, of the trees in an area are killed by a fire, which again produces really good conditions for the seeds. And there's lots of different ways that seeds can be dispersed. If you've ever seen aspen or cottonwood, they produce small seeds with achenes on them, those little feathery parts that let them float long distances on the air. Some seeds are transported by animals, so things like acorns of oaks rely on squirrels and other animals to move those seeds around and cache them. The juniper cones that we talked about are eaten by many birds, and actually the seeds inside will germinate better once it passes through the digestive system of a bird or a rodent. So there's a lot of coevolution between seeds and their dispersers. This painting here is a nice illustration of some interesting interactions in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, so in sort of northwestern Wyoming and Montana. And the bird that you see sitting on those cones is a Clark's nutcracker, which is kind of woodpecker. And the seeds it's eating out of those cones are of the whitebark pine, Pinus albicaulis. And there's a really interesting symbiosis at work here. So the seeds are really large for a pine. They're quite large. And they don't have a wing on it. Many pine seeds have a little wing attached, and that lets them kind of flutter and fly farther distances. But the whitebark pine seeds are wingless, so they can't really disperse very far from the parent tree. And that's a problem because then it's in competition. You know, any seedling would be in competition with its mother. So to get these seeds to disperse, the seeds are big and nutritious, and the Clark's nutcrackers really love them. So the Clark's nutcrackers will gather these seeds and they'll cache them. They'll put big piles of these seeds, especially in sort of talus fields, big bouldery fields up in the higher parts of the mountains. And they'll put these big piles in between the rocks of, hundreds or even thousands of seeds. Now, of course, the nutcrackers will come back and eat the seeds, but they won't eat them all. And so some of those seeds will stay there and they'll germinate into new whitebark pine. You also see a grizzly bear in this picture, and the reason is that this is also really important for grizzly bears. Because grizzly bears, when they emerge from hibernation, they emerge at a time when there's not a lot to eat. And so a really important and nutritious food source for them are these caches of seeds that the Clark's nutcrackers put in between the rocks. So the bears will go up into these talus fields and sniff around and overturn rocks, and they'll find some of these caches. And again, those seeds are really nutritious, high fat content. So it really helps the bears get through a part of the year when there's not a lot else to eat until some of their other food sources come online. So seed dispersal is really important. Some of it happens by wind or water or other sorts of things, but some of it happens by animals, both inside and outside the animal. And that's an important part of tree reproduction to consider. We'll talk a lot more about that as we start to get more into forest ecology.